Committee will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Let me say welcome to all. I'll begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. We want to welcome our witnesses today. Director of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, Mr. Hugh Clements, Acting Director of the Office on Violence Against Women, Ms. Allison Randall, and Chief Financial Officer of the Office of Justice Programs, Ms. Rachel Johnson. The budget request for the Department of Justice includes $4.9 billion in discretionary budget authority for its grant programs, a 17% increase above the current level. It's been many years since the subcommittee held a budget or oversight hearing on DOJ's grant-making components. In the meantime, the DOJ grants portion of the Committee Commerce, Justice, Science, Appropriations bill has grown considerably. In fact, there were over 125 grant programs funded in the 23 Act. Some of these programs began as pilot programs or provided seed money to test concepts that emerged from peer-reviewed research. Many lack detailed authority in law, so the department has been afforded broad discretion in carrying them out. But for years, grant programs were focused on improving policing, addressing emerging scourges like human trafficking and the opioid crisis, or assisting states in dealing with sex offenders or child victims. Some grant programs at the department are still focused on supporting the law enforcement officers who are helping to keep our communities safe. I know there's bipartisan support for formula grant programs like the Burn JAG program that provide additional resources to supplement local law enforcement dollars. These programs are important to our local police and sheriffs, and they deserve our support. Unfortunately, however, many of the grant programs in this budget reflect the priorities of social justice advocacy organizations. With federal debt surpassing $31 trillion, our nation can't afford to use grant funding as a means of virtue signaling. In addition, the year-over-year increases we've seen in recent years are unsustainable and in many cases unsupportable. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for Congress to know what it's paying for in advance. It's imperative that this committee ensure that every dollar provided to the grant-making components is accounted for and is expended in accordance with congressional intent. When Congress leaves so much to the agency's discretion, it needs to have full confidence that the agency is both up to the task and understands its role in carrying out the will of Congress. Unfortunately, I have some concerns in this regard. Today, I'll have some questions about the department's priorities, judgment, and the efficacy of many of the programs Congress has been supporting. Mr. Clements, Ms. Randall, Ms. Johnson, we appreciate you being here today, and we hope that you will enjoy your stay. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Cartwright for any remarks he may wish to make.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Mr. Clements, Ms. Randall, Ms. Johnson, welcome to all of you. I look forward to hearing your testimony about the important grant programs that you're heading up. The grant-making components of DOJ provide valuable resources for states and local governments as well as for nonprofit organizations across our country to carry out public safety projects. and provide services that otherwise would not be possible. It's especially true for our state and local law enforcement agencies. The Burn JAG program is the leading source of federal justice funding to state, local, and tribal jurisdictions. For the last 4 years, this subcommittee has made increasing investments in the grant programs of the Office of Justice Programs, the Office on Violence Against Women, and the community-oriented policing services, including providing for the emergency needs of state and local law enforcement agencies during the COVID pandemic. When you think about the progress made over the last few years, it concerns me greatly that there are powerful and loud voices in the House majority that are poised drastically to cut discretionary spending, and that's something that would greatly harm the critical efforts funded by these programs that you are involved with. Are we really interested in rolling back efforts to make our communities safer and protect the public from crime, to protect the public from evolving threats? Which public safety efforts should be scaled back? Preventing gun violence, helping our veterans, supporting victims of crime, fighting the scourge of opioids in our communities? Which of these efforts can we signal to America that we no longer find them important for us to invest in? The answer is they're all important. Our job on this committee is to provide the resources necessary to keep the United States of America strong, safe, and moving forward. For fiscal year 2024, the Biden administration has requested discretionary funding of $3.4 billion for the Office of Justice Programs, $651 million for the COPS program, and $1 billion for the Violence Against Women Act prevention and prosecution programs. Overall, it's a request of $5 billion in discretionary funding for these programs, which is $733 million over the fiscal year 2023 enacted totals. My concern is that proposals by many in Congress to slash budgets will greatly damage much of the progress that we all have made to enhance public safety efforts and support those in need. So I look forward to discussing further the impacts of these potential cuts, as well as other grant-related issues at this hearing. And again, thank you for being here. I look forward to your testimony. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Each witness will be recognized for a 3-minute opening statement. Mr. Clements, you may begin.
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cartwright, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the oversight of the Department of Justice's grant-making components. My name is Hugh T. Clements, Jr., and I am the Director of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, better known as the COPS Office. I've just recently joined the COPS Office after nearly 40 years with the Providence, Rhode Island Police Department. During my career, I started as a night patrol officer with Providence's Uniform Division, worked in both the Special Investigations Bureau and the Detective Bureau, served as Deputy Chief, and then in 2012, I was appointed Chief and promoted to the rank of Colonel. It is my sincere hope that my experience in policing, rising through the ranks, and serving in many different roles, as well as working alongside my community partners, will help to continue the valuable work of the COPS Office in supporting constitutional policing for the law enforcement profession. The mission of the COPS Office is to advance public safety through community policing, focusing on collaborative efforts to prevent and respond to crime, social disorder, and fear of crime. The COPS Office has added community policing officers to the nation's streets, enhanced crime-fighting technology, supported crime prevention initiatives, and provided training and technical assistance to help advance community policing. To date, the COPS Office has funded thousands of officer positions for the majority of the nation's law enforcement agencies in small in large jurisdictions alike. The President's fiscal year 2024 budget request for the COPS office is $651 million in discretionary funding and $2 billion in mandatory funding under the President's Safer America Plan. Funding highlights include $537 million for the COPS hiring program. This funding assists agencies in hiring additional sworn law enforcement professionals to increase their community policing capacity and crime prevention efforts, all while building trust and legitimacy with the communities they serve. Set-aside funding from that hiring amount will provide awards for law enforcement mental health and wellness, the development and implementation of innovative policing strategies, the continuation of our collaborative reform initiative, and resources for Indian country. As a final note, additional funding will be used for grant programs that combat the spread of heroin and methamphetamine, strengthen school safety efforts, and provide active shooter training to law enforcement and other first responders. These are all initiatives that have been successful in prior fiscal years and which have been shown to enhance officer morale, improve community relations, and have a deterrent effect on crime. Thank you again for this opportunity to address the committee, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Randall?
Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cartwright, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify about the work of the Office on Violence Against Women, or OVW. OVW's $1 billion request would give communities the tools they need to address the violent crimes of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. Our grants support survivors at nearly any place they would go, whether that's the justice system or a hospital, a housing program, or a faith-based service provider. OVW grants also support specialized policing and prosecution units so that the crimes of sexual and domestic violence are given the focus and the skill that these complex cases require. The cornerstone of OVW's grant programming is a coordinated community response. Prosecutors, law enforcement, courts, service providers, community organizations work together to get victims what they need and to stop offenders from causing further harm. Research shows that these approaches are effective, and we see results from our grantees. For example, in Virginia, the City of Lynchburg's OVW grant supports a protection order advocate based in a courthouse, as well as a prosecutor and an investigator dedicated to these cases. As a result, the city reported that more victims were seeking protection orders, and the prosecutor's office reported lowering the percentage of cases declined. But communities face growing challenges. A grantee in Western Maryland explained that from 2020 to 2021, the number of victims served increased 32%, but the number of services provided to those individuals increased 134%. Like many grantees, they are seeing more intense levels of violence and more complex issues, but with no more staff to respond. This can be especially true in communities where limited infrastructure or geographic isolation can make it challenging for victims to pursue safety. We have to meet survivors where they are. Mountain Comprehensive Care Center in Prestonsburg, Kentucky is one of many OVW grant recipients that uses VAWA funding to meet this challenge. The center provides wraparound services that include transportation. That's a common need we hear from survivors in rural communities. The Center Against Sexual and Family Violence in El Paso, Texas, established relationships in 5 neighboring rural counties that help victims access resources right in their hometowns. Having conducted site visits across the United States over the last year, I can confirm that state, local, and tribal grantees are stretching each dollar as far as it will go. They need more support. The additional $300 million requested is an important investment in a safe and vibrant future. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cartwright, and all members of this subcommittee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today about the important work we're doing at the Office of Justice Programs to protect our communities and advance our goal of equal justice for all Americans. On behalf of OJP, I would also like to express my deep appreciation for the ongoing support you have provided to our programs and communities throughout the country. America faces a number of public safety challenges, including gun violence, an alarming rise in overdose deaths, and an escalation of crimes motivated by hate and bias. President Biden's fiscal year 24 budget requests over $5.6 billion to address these and other public safety challenges while accelerating justice system reforms and increasing community trust, transforming the juvenile justice system into one that is effective and equitable, ensuring rights and access to services for all victims of crime, and advancing science and innovation to guide policy and practice. The administration's Safe for America plan, a comprehensive blueprint for protecting communities by adopting evidence-based strategies, laid the foundation for many of these goals. A core element of this plan is the $4.4 billion requested over 5 years for the Gun Crime Prevention Strategic Fund, a bold initiative to provide communities with much-needed resources to prevent crime and support law enforcement. The Community Violence Intervention Program, totaling $250 million with resources that Congress provided in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, will allow us to continue scaling up local community-based approaches as a complement to law enforcement. Under the Accelerating Justice System Reform Initiative, $300 million will support evidence-informed strategies across the public safety spectrum, from pretrial to post-release. Part of a $15 billion proposal over 10 years, this initiative will help communities prevent violence while easing the burden on law enforcement in instances that may not merit police intervention. The President's budget allocates $760 million for programs designed to improve the outcomes for young people who come into contact with the juvenile system. The research is clear that we can hold these youth accountable while putting them on a path to success. The budget requests $1.2 billion under the Crime Victims Fund to provide a full range of services to victims of crime. And finally, the budget requests more than $235 million to support research, statistics, and scientific innovation. This budget represents a comprehensive, focused investment of resources to meet a full range of public safety challenges facing America today. We're grateful to our many state, local, and tribal partners who work with us to meet these challenges, and to the members of the subcommittee for your continued support. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule for questions. We will endeavor to be respectful of our witnesses' time, and we'll follow up with you should we have any additional questions. I'll begin by recognizing myself. Ms. Johnson, we're facing a dire situation with opioids in the country. Fentanyl is being trafficked across our southern border at an alarming rate, and more than 136 Americans are dying every day from opioid overdose, 70% of which, by the way, is fentanyl related. Given that one of the highlights of your budget is keeping our country safe, it's difficult to comprehend why DOJ has proposed to reduce the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act programs. The request for these programs is $34 million below current levels and $4 million below fiscal 22. Can you provide some insight into how OJP is prioritizing grant programs and whether combating the opioid crisis is considered a key part of the keeping our country safe strategy? Can you help us?
Yes, sir. Thank you. We request $411 million for Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act programs. That's similar to the percentage that we've requested in prior years of our state and local law enforcement assistance. We also recognize that there are other programs such as Second Chance Act and Reentry that will provide for substance use disorder treatment. It remains a key priority of the administration.
But why slash these programs, which are worse than they've ever been?
The budget makes tough choices to balance competing priorities. Again, it maintains a percentage similar to prior years for these very important programs.
The mission of the COPS office is to provide public safety by building trust and collaboration between law enforcement and the communities they serve. The fiscal '24 budget proposes $651 million for COPS. Many state and local law enforcement agencies in rural and low-populated counties critically underfunded and understaffed. Chronic law enforcement understaffing poses a significant threat to communities. How can COPS programs assist critically understaffed or under-resourced law enforcement agencies?
So Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I just came from the field after 37 and a half years, and I know how critical the funding is to large, mid-size, and I'm hearing more recently for small and rural entities. We've just met with that coalition, and we have a formula in the office that allows us to provide funding for 50% of the agencies or municipalities with more than 150,000, and 50% of that funding goes to agencies with under 150,000 in population. So I know coming from the field, this funding is critical to provide the proper workforce in combating violent crime and fentanyl, which is a crisis in this country, small and rural, right up to large cities.
What percentage of COPS hiring program funding is used for management and administration costs of the COPS program?
That percentage, Mr. Chairman, is 10%.
Mr. Cartwright?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony. I have questions. I'm going to start with you, Colonel Clements and Ms. Johnson, about the reduction in law enforcement positions. Legislation that's just been introduced by the Speaker and will be voted on later this week would require cuts of as much as 22% or more in non-defense discretionary spending. I'd like to know from each of you what impacts such a cut would have on our ability to support our police and protect our communities. Colonel Clements?
Thank you, Ranking Member Cartwright. As you know, in the field, there is a crisis as well with recruitment and retention, which has exacerbated the shortage of the workforce in large and small jurisdictions alike. Cuts in this particular area would be devastating. They would be crippling. I know coming from the field and listening to the voices in the field, including law enforcement organizations, management, labor, and most importantly, community, who would suffer the most would be the community in this fight we have in our communities against the opioid crisis, fentanyl, violent crime, the proliferation like I've never seen before. My last 2 years as chief in the capital city, I never saw the amount of firearms that I saw those last 2 years. It would be crippling. In Providence.
Yeah.
It would be devastating to
Colonel,
communities.
are you able to comment what the current number of law enforcement positions supported by Justice Department grant funding is right now?
So with this funding, it will allow for the hiring of about 1,500 officers, and if we were to take a a cut, it would probably ring true to the tune of 300 to 400 officers in several states around this country.
Okay. Thank you for that, and thank you for your service all those years.
Thank you, sir.
And Ms. Johnson, same questions to you. What impacts would cuts of that nature have on our ability to support our police and protect our communities?
I would echo that it would be also devastating. Just for example, in our Burn Justice Assistance Grants Program, which is the leading source of federal funds for criminal justice agencies, for states, it would be an average of a $1 million reduction to their formula grants. Very significant and difficult for them to bridge that gap.
Okay, and you heard Colonel Clements tell us about a loss of 300 to 400 officers under the COPS program. How about under Burn JAG grants? How many positions would be lost if we had a cut of 22%?
I believe it would vary based on the how the states and localities deploy their grants. So I'm not prepared to give that number to you today.
Okay, I don't know is acceptable. A lot of people in Washington don't understand that. Well, over to you, Acting Director Randall. According to the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, fewer than half of local sexual assault programs have a full-time sexual assault therapist on staff. And we know that rape crisis centers are struggling to maintain staff and serve the needs of all survivors. You emphasized something in your testimony. You said how important it is that we meet survivors where they are. What do you mean by that?
Well, we've heard and seen the exact same thing that you've mentioned, that sexual assault service providers don't have the resources that they need. I hear about survivors who are raped, but then on a waiting list to get counseling, and that's why we've asked for a $21.5 million increase in our sexual assault services program, and that's a formula that will reach every state to allow them to meet those needs. And when I talk about meeting all survivors where they are, that means, survivors have different needs. The needs of a survivor in New York City are different from the needs of a survivor in Northern Alabama. Everyone needs access to safety and justice, but you need services that respect your community and your culture, that respond to the unique challenges and the unique resiliency in that community. So to that end, we've done a lot of outreach to small communities, to rural communities.
I don't mean to
try get
interrupt
funding
you,
out
but
there.
I'm on a limited time here. Ms. Randall, you are the acting director of the Office of Violence Against Women. What is the impact of a 22% cut on the programs that support your office?
It's life and death. We estimate that tens of thousands of victims would not be served.
Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Garcia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got to be honest, I'm a little underwhelmed. The fact that, first of all, I apologize that your budgets haven't been behaving like you probably expected them to. The inflation that we've experienced over the last 3 years, 7% or so compounding over 30 months now, makes your buying power behave effectively 21 to 23% less than what it should have been. So on behalf of Congress out of control spending over the last 3 years, I want to apologize for a lack of buying power. But as I'm looking at your budgets, these increases are actually aggravating the inflation problem that we're having on some levels. I don't understand, I guess at a top level, why the president's budget request cuts cops. I agree with everything you said, Mr. Clements, and I appreciate your service and what you're doing today for our communities and our neighborhoods. So I don't understand, I can't wrap my brain around why we would cut the COPS grant funding from the White House request. That makes no sense to me. And then, so I guess my question is primarily to Mrs. Randall and Mrs. Johnson about your performance overall in the last 2 years. How would you rate both of your respective areas in terms of how well these programs have been working? And sort of what are the results of those programs at a macro level, or if there's specific examples that you can cite?
Sure. We examine the performance of our grantees. They provide regular performance reports. We're out there in the field meeting with them, seeing the results on the ground, and we're funding evidence-based best practices. So for example, when we fund sexual assault nurse examiner programs, we know that, that they're collecting better evidence, which leads to more convictions, and that survivors will be
How many
better
more
served.
convictions was it?
I would have to take a look at our data and get back to you on that.
I'd like to see that, yep.
Delighted to do so.
Yeah, the more database testimonials you have, the better, I think, for us, so that we can make these decisions. There's discussions around a 22% cut. I don't know where that number's coming from, but when you look at what you guys have received, in FY '22, it was $3.3 billion, and now the request is $4.9 billion, and this accounts for, obviously, the aforementioned decrement to the COPS grants within this overall budget. So that represents a 48% increase from just FY '22 numbers to the requests from the president's budget here this year. So I guess the fundamental question is, are we getting a 48% increase in terms of performance, whether it's more convictions or better protection of women? By the way, I was an original co-sponsor of the Violence Against Women, the clean reauthorization that was included in the FY '22 Omni. So I'm a big supporter of VAWA, and I think we need to do better on this front. So this isn't me saying that these programs aren't valued or aren't important. My question is, are they effective, though? And are these taxpayer dollars being used correctly? I think the values that we are seeing on VAWA come out to roughly $20 million per state if you average it across 50 states in this request. So the question is that enough? And are you getting the benefits that the taxpayers would expect to see with these values? I frankly don't see it. I hear the words you're saying, but I'm not seeing the metric and the data behind the value proposition of your funding line. So I would love to get that, if we can get it offline and for the record, whatever data and statistics that you show, either in OJP or in VAWA, that shows that these increases are merited. I would also assert that if you're doing a good job with the $4.1 billion from FY '23, and if you did a good job with the $3.3 billion from FY '22, then those budget levels shouldn't preclude you from also being successful in FY '24. So if you can expand on that offline for the record, whatever data you have, success stories, I don't understand why the president would request less money for the COPS grants. We've utilized those in my district in California to great success. That's us getting maximum dollars to the local agencies with great efficiencies and great results. But I need to see that type of data and results-based decision-making here coming out of the other two arms of this if we can. So with that, if you guys can commit to providing that data, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. We would love the opportunity to share more. We have a lot in our reports to Congress, but even more that we can share.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Meng?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Clements, I wanted to piggyback a little bit off of what Ranking Member Cartwright asked before about the awards for COPS hiring program. As you know, the fiscal year '24 budget request totals $651 million, with over $2 million dedicated to the COPS hiring program as required under the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. The money is intended to keep communities safe by hiring and training 100,000 additional police officers for community policing. What ramifications do the House Republicans' recently proposed 1% growth in budget caps mean for the DOJ's ability to comply with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act? And what would the impact specifically on the ability to hire and train these additional police officers be?
So thank you, Representative. So yes, it really would be crippling and devastating to lose any funding towards putting more police officers on the street with what we're seeing going on in our communities. And furthermore, the large stakeholder groups that we entertain and speak to all the time, we're close to the field, and our mantra in the COPS office is by the field, for the field. We listen to the field, and we're hearing that, you know, with all of the major issues, de-escalation, use of force, specialized units, there is great guidance that comes from this office in the form of publication or convening sessions. We use the bully pulpit of the office to have convening sessions to give the best guidance to the field around these hot topic areas. So it would hurt our police agencies, our police leaders, but more importantly, it would hurt our communities.
And it would hurt the ability, as required by the bill, to be able to hire and train 100,000 additional police officers, correct?
Correct, that forecast several years out, yes.
Thank you. And Ms. Johnson, I wanted to applaud the work that OJP has done thus far to engage communities and local law enforcement in preventing and combating hate crimes, especially with the money you've provided directly to communities through the Community-Based Approaches to Advancing Justice grant program. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that potential funding caps would have on underserved communities who are eligible for grant funds available under the Community-Based Approaches to Advancing Justice and Jabara Hire No Hate grants?
Yes, those deep cuts would result in, typically for our competitive-based programs, 20 to 25% reduction in the amount going out or the number of awards. So it would greatly impact the ability of recipients, community-based organizations to do outreach and establish community awareness and other things to combat hate crimes.
How many jurisdictions or organizations do you think would lose awards to combat hate crimes if your office is operating under a budget at the fiscal year 22 level?
I'm happy to follow up with you with exact numbers. FY22 was the first year of that program. It's very early, but we're grateful for the funding that we received and have received much positive feedback from the field on those resources.
But if there were potential funding caps, as has been proposed, would it make it harder for us to combat and prevent hate crimes?
Yes, it would.
Thank you. I yield back.
Judge Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And welcome to all of you. I authorized the Police Act, which allows the law enforcement and medical personnel to use federal grant funds to train and better be prepared for the active shooter situations they'll encounter. However, with only $651 million, it is a decrease in the Police Act, and that's where those grants are located. It's a $1 million decrease. Now, with the events that we all know about and the good that the active shooter program, in fact, the last active shooter issue we saw trained active shooter officers go to the sound of the guns and save numerous lives by doing what they were trained to do. And we've also seen places where they stood outside until the gunfire stopped and seen the damage that people who didn't and weren't trained by active shooter how to go to the sound of the guns and what the consequences of that. Now, with this reduction of $1 million in what I call training funds, how's that going to affect this active shooter program? Who wants to answer?
Thank you, Representative. And it's true, we've seen both sides of how to handle these situations, some impeccably courageous and brave, and we've seen the other, of which we have we have a consultation going on in one of those jurisdictions now to review lessons learned, best practices, and to give guidance for the field going forward. But the training that we do is critical in communities around this country in how to handle these type incidents while they're taking place, before they occur with the proper training, and after action guidance on best practices. And we've seen some tremendous brave actions by officers who've been well-trained in active shooter, and it's critical training on communications, policy, deployment, tactics, Incident command is very important when you have a large-scale event with many departments, many agencies involved on the ground at the same event.
Yeah, with a $1 million decrease in funding at cops, where now the big people send their people to active training. It's the little guy and the mid-sized guy that doesn't have the funds unless they have a cops grant to go do active shooting. And most of our smaller jurisdictions number are all over this country. And I hate to see us not give them the opportunity to do the best they can to stop this situation. And the last 3 or 4 have been in rural areas. And some of them were active trained, like this kid that shot up the elementary school. They did the right thing in every way, the best I can see. Yet you go back to Texas, the thing that happened in Texas. None of them were trained, and they sat and waited. And yet they could have applied for a COPS grant, even the small jurisdictions, and gotten that training. And I hate to see this reduced. Do I have time for a second question? Okay, despite the requested budget decrease for the Office of Justice Programs and the $2.44 billion designated for state and local enforcement assistance, the present budget is essentially flat on the funds for Brian Bragg grants. This formula grant program is at the heart of what the department should be focusing on, state and local law enforcement. Why is OPJ prioritizing funding for progressive administrative priorities instead of local law enforcement agencies at a time when crime continues to be on the rise in most cities and law enforcement agencies report struggling retaining staff and financing necessary to equip and train staff?
Thank you for that question. Reducing violent crime remains a priority for the department and OJP. In addition to the burn assistance grants, we also asked for $884 million for our gun crime prevention fund, which would help fund task forces hiring, training, equipment that could reduce and prevent violent crime.
I yield back.
Mr. Tron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for appearing here today. Today, as co-chair of the bipartisan Second Chance Task Force, I'm focused on improving reentry outcomes at the Bureau of Prisons because the data is clear. The best way to reduce recidivism is through stable employment. In fact, the probability of reconviction for someone who's employed for 2 months at $10 an hour or more is only 8%, a fraction of the probability of an unemployed ex-offender over 60%. Ms. Johnson, one of the best ways to help these returning citizens is to get them a job, and that's to clear their records. Millions of these individuals are eligible to have their records sealed or expunged, but the process is too complex, too expensive. State-passed clean slate automatic record clearing laws are costly and have been a barrier to widespread adoption. Tomorrow, we're going to reintroduce the bipartisan Fresh Start Act, which will provide assistance to states to help them implement their clean slate laws. We also made language last year in the InChip program to provide grants to help them implement their automatic clearing laws. Could you please talk about OJP, the assistance OJP has provided to states to help them establish and implement their record clearing?
Yes, thank you. As part of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, $40 million a year, or in total $80 million for FY22 and 23 was provided for InChip. And we have accepted applications through the end of February and are expecting to make awards within the coming months. And part of that would include some expungement activities.
So if that's cut 22%, you would expect we'd have more folks going back into prison and spending more. We would then spend more money to keep them incarcerated. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you, ma'am. In addition to clean slate laws, I'm concerned that the Republicans plan to decrease funding for the Second Chance program, which was overwhelmingly passed during President Bush's second term, provides vital assistance to the formerly incarcerated to help them reintegrate again society and again get jobs. Ms. Johnson, could you please talk about how decreasing funding to 22 level will impact OJP's ability to help these returning citizens get a second chance?
Our Second Chance Act programs and providing reentry opportunities, supporting those reintegrating to their communities are very important, and a 22% cut, again, would have a devastating effect on states and localities and jurisdictions trying to support those reentering the communities.
Ms. Johnson, would you agree with the statement that if these folks don't have a job, they're more likely to return to crime, and therefore these cuts of 22% are making our country less safe every day?
I would agree that the cuts would make the country less safe.
Too bad. We ought to be safer. A few weeks ago, I attended the RX Summit hosted by Chairman Rogers. One of the themes we kept hearing about was the importance of comprehensive opioid stimulant and substance use program, COSAP. The program is vital in our efforts to address the opioid crisis. Despite over 108,000 died in 2021, similar number in 2022, cutting levels of FY22. Could you talk about how decreasing that funding will affect OJP's ability to combat the opioid crisis?
Again, we would be looking at 22% cuts, which would reduce the number of awards by 20 to 30%, and the size of the awards, reducing the amount of services that could be provided in terms of substance abuse treatment and other services.
So at the end of the day, these 22% cuts proposed mean our country's less safer because folks don't have jobs, and it means folks are going to be more likely to be sucked into the opioid fentanyl crisis, and we have more deaths. Let's sum it up.
Again, it would have a devastating impact on our programs and ability to make people safe and provide services.
Thank you, ma'am. I yield back.
Mr. Clyde?
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. And I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Given the current trajectory of our national debt approaching $32 trillion, I think it's more important than ever that we really take a detailed look at how our federal government is spending taxpayer dollars to ensure fiscal responsibility. That's what taxpayers demand. Ms. Johnson, in May 2021, President Biden submitted his FY22 budget to Congress. The budget included a request for $100 million for a new community-based alternatives to youth incarceration initiative to offer incentives to states, localities, and tribes that introduce reforms designed to reduce youth incarceration. In the ensuing FY22 CJS bill cycle, the House majority and the Senate majority each proposed $50 million for the program. It did not survive the conference process, and the program received no funding when FY22 appropriations were completed in March of 2022. In May 2022, DOJ released a solicitation for grant applications for the Community-Based Alternatives to Youth Incarceration pilot program. Despite the solicitation being unsupported by both authority and funding, at least one funding award was made. And Mr. Chairman, I would like unanimous consent to submit this award of $500,000 for the record. Thank you. So my question is, where did this money come from? This $500,000 that was not authorized and not appropriated, where did it come from?
Yes, we made a $500,000 award using authority under the Justice Reinvested Initiative from the FY22 appropriation for a solicitation to pilot the community-based alternatives to youth incarceration.
So this particular program that Congress specifically did not authorize and did not fund, did not appropriate money to, you simply took money from somewhere else and funded it yourself?
As part of our spend plan process, we did notify our intention to issue a solicitation under the Justice Reinvestment Initiative program to pilot the community-based alternatives to youth incarceration. And this was done because of the field has identified this need, and we believed it was in the best interest of supporting those needs.
Okay, well, I think the best interest is what Congress determines, because we speak for the people, not the Department of Justice. We speak for the people. All right, on April 24th, 2022, in an interview that aired on 60 Minutes, FBI Director Christopher Wray singled out violent youth as a major factor in the 29% increase in the U.S. murder rate in 2020. Following the CJS Subcommittee's 2023 Department of Justice budget hearing, Ranking Member Adeholt, at the time Ranking Member, raised concerns about the proposed program and submitted questions to Attorney General Garland about the program's dangerous purpose. You know, if you do the crime, you need to do the time, as this keeps criminals in jail and off the street and prevents more crime. So, in its FY23 budget submission, DOJ once again requested $100 million for the unauthorized program. Again, in the FY23 process, no funds were provided for the community-based alternatives to youth incarceration program. But in February 2023, DOJ once again announced funding and solicited applications for the program, and this is the actual community-based alternatives to youth incarceration solicitation right here, which the deadline was yesterday, actually. So why is DOJ making a solicitation for grant applications for the community-based alternatives to youth incarceration pilot program, again, when there is no funding and no authorization, specifically from Congress?
We make awards and advertiser solicitations within the confines of our appropriations. I would say that this program is not an attempt to say that youth, especially those who commit serious and violent offenses, should not be placed in a locked facility. This program is focused on repurposing emptying juvenile facilities.
Okay, so how much federal funding is being set aside to support this program?
I believe it is, I don't have that number in front of me. I will have to follow up for the record.
Okay, would you please, and are you signing off on these actions?
The decisions about these solicitations are ultimately made by our agency head,
And that would be Garland?
by the Office of Justice Programs agency head.
Okay, all right. Okay, I guess my time has expired, and I yield back.
Mr. Klein?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Office of Justice Programs has requested a 16% increase in funding, with some programs receiving an increase of 80% or more. While I appreciate Ms. Johnson coming to testify, I do wish that we had the department director here to speak more about the various programs and grants operated by OJP. Ask about the Project Safe Neighborhoods Block Grant Program, which seeks to combat criminal street gangs and transnational crime groups and is up for reauthorization. Can you describe the types of grants utilized by this program?
Yes, the budget requests $40 million for Project Safe Neighborhoods. It's a nationwide initiative that brings together federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement officials, among other stakeholders. It's coordinated by the U.S. attorneys in the 94 federal judicial districts. And it's customized to account for local violent crime problems and resources.
I note that a bipartisan group of senators has legislation to reauthorize the program, but also adds much-needed transparency requirements. For example, how the area that received the funding spent the funds from the program, the total number of criminal prosecutions carried out, disaggregated by the number of federal and state prosecutions, and the results of those prosecutions, the community outreach efforts performed in the area, and the number and description of the violent crime offenses committed in the area. Wouldn't you agree that these transparency requirements are necessary to ensure an effective grant program?
I believe that transparency in general is favorable.
Thank you. Roughly $2.2 million has been awarded to the Vera Institute of Justice, which according to their website is committed to pretrial justice by ending money bail. Last week, the House Judiciary Committee, which I'm also a member of, held a hearing in New York City to shed light on pervasive problems we're seeing in Democrat-led cities across the country, a result of progressive policies like ending cash bail. In fact, in New York, the state legislature passed bail reform in 2019. Since then, a March 2023 study by researchers at John Jay College found that recidivism rates increased for violent felony offenders after implementation of the new bail reform law. In my home state of Virginia, we were proud that as a result of reforms that we took back in the 90s, including abolition of parole, that we became the we had the least, the lowest rate of recidivism of any state in the country. And that's something that Virginia was very proud of. Wouldn't you agree that it's wrong for DOJ to provide millions of dollars in grants to organizations that advocate for policies that lead to further victimization by allowing repeat offenders to be released back into society?
I'm not familiar with the details of the sources that you're citing, but I would say that, again, reducing violent crime, supporting effective reentry programs remains a priority for the department and the Office of Justice programs.
As a former prosecutor of domestic violence, I know all too well the importance of the Violence Against Women Act and the programs administered by the Office of Violence Against Women. In the written testimony, you make note of some of the ways in which this office is assisting local communities like Lynchburg, Virginia, which I represented prior to redistricting for my first 2 terms. Ms. Randall, how much emphasis is placed by the Office on Violence Against Women on restorative justice programs?
Our office is really focused on, supporting state and local law enforcement and prosecution in responding to domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as victim service providers. Congress has administered a small amount. I believe last year it was $15 million for restorative justice.
Okay, would you agree that restorative justice requires both parties agree to participate?
Yes, that's in fact a requirement in the statute.
Okay, yeah, in fact, a major component of a restorative justice program is that the defendant apologizes to the victim, and the victim accepts this apology, often in the presence of the defendant, correct?
Not necessarily, but the key requirement is that restorative justice would only work if the victim agrees that they want this process at all, and then the process itself must be driven by the victim and what they want. If they don't want to receive
But
an apology, they
that
shouldn't.
sometimes there's pressure for the victim to participate in these programs by a prosecutor in order to get a plea deal?
While we haven't launched our program yet, it won't be connected to prosecution, but there should never be pressure on victims. I completely agree with you that pressure on victims is a problem.
I agree, and that's why restorative justice is a poor fit for domestic violence cases, but I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That completes the first round, and we will now proceed to a second round of questions. And I'll begin by yielding to myself. Ms. Johnson, let me draw your attention to 2 set-asides. One, the training and technical assistance set-aside, and secondly, the burn JAG set-aside to combat increases in crime. Tell me how much was made available by DOJ in the current fiscal year for those 2 set-asides.
I don't recall for the JAG set aside what was made available for FY23. For the FY24 budget, it would be approximately $27 million. Based on the request, it would likely be similar. For training and technical assistance, about 6% or $330 million was identified in our FY23 spend plan to support key training and technical assistance programs for grantees.
And how much was the JAG set aside?
I don't have that number for FY23 in front of me.
Will you have the numbers for the other 2?
For training and technical assistance and FY23, we identified slightly over $330 million in our spend plan that we submitted to Congress in February.
Well, can you get me the burn JAG set-aside amount?
I absolutely can.
Does anybody on the staff that's with you know the answer?
I will follow up.
All right, find out before we leave here today, and we'll.
Yes, sir.
What, if any, policies does DOJ have in place to ensure that these funds are not being used in a manner that runs contrary to congressional intent?
We have a rigorous oversight program in terms of grantees have to submit quarterly performance and financial reports. We're also reviewing their progress. We have a robust financial and programmatic monitoring program to assess and make sure that grantees and recipients are complying with the federal grants. We lay out as part of our spend plan our intention of how we are complying or intend to issue solicitations consistent with the authorities provided by each appropriations line item.
Ms. Johnson, the Office of Justice Programs is requesting $15 million for a new program aimed at sealing or expunging the criminal records of juveniles. Is that consistent with the administration's support for enhanced firearms background checks that review juvenile records, or would it undermine that position?
This program is focused on aiding justice-involved youth and set aside barriers that would prevent a successful reentry into society.
I understand. But is that inconsistent with the administration's support for enhanced firearms background checks?
I'm not prepared to answer your question today. I will have to take it back to the department.
I'm sorry?
No, it is, I don't believe it's inconsistent. As I said, our budget is approved by the department and the Office of Management and Budget, but I'm happy to take your question back. I'm hearing your concerns and provide additional details.
The solicitation for grants under the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, enacted last summer, included as an allowable use so-called gun courts. They're diversion programs wherein participants can go through a probation and monitoring period instead of prison time for illegal gun possession. They're also used to help gun crime offenders wipe felony records away. Does the department believe this initiative would advance efforts to reduce gun violence?
If you're speaking about the State Crisis Intervention Program, it's a formula-based program, and we provided examples of potential ways that states could execute that funding. But overall, yes, we do think it will be helpful in reducing gun crime and violence in the country.
My time has expired, Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Chairman Rogers was just talking about the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the BSCA, that was passed in fiscal year 2022. It's $1.4 billion, which is $280 million a year for 5 years. It was provided to the OJP for violent crime-related programs, and $100 million, which is $20 million over 5 years, was provided to cops for school safety programs. What I'm interested in is the level of application for these grants. How much in dollars in qualified applications are you folks receiving for these programs, Colonel Clements and Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Ranking Member Cartwright. So the programs at COPS remain wildly popular, and we just had a workshop session yesterday when over 1,600 participants took part in the workshop. On the SVPP side, school violence prevention, there, to date, and it's not closed yet, there are 641 applicants. So the needs outpace the ability to award these programs, so not everyone will be funded. And it's a concern, but we do have a provision in the formula where those previously not funded are taken into higher consideration.
Do you agree with that, Ms. Johnson?
Yes, I would agree that the number of applications are outpacing the number of awards that we can make.
In fact, am I correct that the combination of BSCA funds and FY24 requests in the president's budget request would still not cover the anticipated volume of qualified requests for these programs?
Yes, that's correct.
Is that right, Colonel?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, I want to jump over to the Crime Victims Fund and talk about the stability of that, Ms. Johnson, if I can. 2021, Congress enacted the Victims of Crime Act, fixed to the VOCA fixed to sustain the Crime Victims Fund. It's a bill that allowed for revenues collected from deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements to be deposited into the Crime Victims Fund. Can you give us a brief update on the fund and any suggestions on options to help further stabilize this fund?
Yes, the Fixed VOCA Act has been wildly successful. Approximately $960 million since it was enacted has been deposited from non-prosecution agreements and deferred prosecution agreements through March of 2023. And the fund is at a healthy balance of over $2 billion as of March. So we are, we believe that the reduced obligation cap of $1.2 billion will help stabilize the fund for fiscal year '24.
All right, we're going to check in with your office from time to time to help monitor that, if that's all right. Now, Ms. Randall, last question for you. We are aware of what they call a shadow epidemic of domestic violence and sexual abuse, especially during COVID. I'm told service providers are still dealing with the more complex cases of that. And according to the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, there's been a 70% increase in the demand for sexual assault services over the past year alone. How does your budget request help service providers and law enforcement personnel respond to these crimes and meet the needs of survivors?
That's exactly what we've seen and heard across the country, and that's what research has shown, that increase in rates of violence and the increase in severity. So that's one of the many reasons we've requested significantly more funding for our Stop Violence Against Women formula grant, which will reach all states, and it funds police, prosecution, courts, and victim services. As I mentioned, our sexual assault services formula grant. Also through some of our most in-demand programs like legal assistance for victims and transitional housing. In the wake of the pandemic, we hear constant concerns about connecting survivors with transitional housing that allows survivors to become self-sufficient. And we believe we will have great results from those programs.
Well, thank you for that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Judge Carter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a question. Well, I got a conversation I want to have. In your, Ms. Randall, in your very rapid restitution submission, you talked about increased protective orders. Now, protective orders are in the purview of the lawyers. How does your agency deal with that? And do they do it properly?
Mm-hmm. We support the issuance of protection orders by funding prosecutors, by funding civil legal attorneys, our Legal Assistance for Victims program. Those attorneys are often quite successful, and we'll be happy to share the exact details in securing restraining orders for survivors. And then research shows that if you have a restraining order, you're significantly less likely to experience further violence?
Well, I tried in my time on the bench, 20,000 divorce cases. That's a lot. And people ask for protective orders in almost every divorce case. And if their lawyer didn't do it, I told them, this is a piece of paper. It doesn't protect you. Don't wave it in front of a mad husband or wife and say, I've got a protective order. Leave me alone, because they will probably hit you right through that protective order. That protective order enhances what you can do to them when you take them back to court.
Yeah, I so agree
If you're
with
not
you.
doing it properly, a protective order is just a piece of paper.
That's why it's got to be paired with, strong law enforcement responses so that law enforcement can respond quickly and safely and well. We provide training for courts. Not every judge is as well educated on this as you, so we help educate judges on these issues. But it's a key reason why supporting law enforcement is one of our funding priorities.
And you're doing it mostly through the criminal justice side, not the family law side.
The training we provide for courts does include the family law side. For example, we have a Justice for Families grant program that specifically addresses family courts.
Okay, Ms. Johnson, I didn't come prepared to ask this question, but you just talked about a fund of $2 billion that's coming from deals made in court, right?
And criminal fines.
Yeah.
Penalties, yes.
Deals made in court. Is there any direction as to what that's going to be used for?
Yes, it's an obligation cap of 1.2 billion for the crime victims funds. It funds services for victims of crime. Most of it goes out as formula assistance to states.
So what does that mean?
The good majority of it goes out to states for victims assistance and compensation funds. So it provides housing for victims, counseling, other services that they might need.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to go back to my line of questioning regarding the community-based alternatives to youth incarceration program. So you said the agency head is the one who signs off on this diversion of funds. Is that correct? And would that be Administrator Liz Ryan?
The agency head and Administrator Ryan would determine the solicitation under, as authorized under the, in this case, the Justice Reinvestment Initiative.
Okay, so she authorizes this $500,000 of funds to be diverted.
I would not say that the funds were diverted. We indicated in our.
If Congress doesn't authorize them and Congress doesn't appropriate to them, then they get diverted. And I think that's one of the reasons why citizens don't trust the Department of Justice, because, Congress decides where money's to be spent because we're the representatives of the people. It's not the three-letter agencies of the executive branch. Now, in your statement, you say approximately $2.3 billion in mandatory funding is requested, including $1.2 billion for the Crime Victims Fund. Well, you just told our ranking member there that the fund has $2 billion in it as of March, and you want another $1.2 billion, and I guess that $2 billion comes from deposits from criminal fines and deals made with those who are being convicted of a crime of something or other, all right? So why do you need $1.2 billion more? You've already got $2 billion in the fund.
The $2.1 billion in the fund includes the $1.9 billion that was authorized, appropriated by Congress to be expended in FY '23.
Okay.
So we will also have to continue to collect deposits to expend the $1.2 billion proposed in FY '24 and to continue services to victims. Again, most of it going out to the states in the formula program.
So the vast majority of the money going into the fund is from the federal government, not from criminal fines and that sort of thing.
No, it's a mandatory collection. It's coming from fines and prosecutions.
Okay, and you also said 884 million for a new gun violence prevention strategic fund. Can you talk a little bit more about that? That's a heck of a lot of money. I know it's on the mandatory side, but what is that going toward? That's a third of, and that's almost $1 billion.
Yes, it's 884 million for the new Gun Crime Prevention and Strategic Fund, part of the President Safer America Act. Primarily, it goes to supporting hiring for critical positions, law enforcement, criminal analysts, to support task forces, to support additional training and technology, and so forth.
Okay, all right. I guess that's all the questions I have. Thank you, and I yield back.
Is Mr. Klein not here? Well, this concludes today's hearing. Thank you for appearing before us, answering questions. Without objection, all members will have 7 days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. I'm sorry?
Mr. Klein just walked in the door.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. If you're done, you're done.
You're recognized.
Apologize. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just more, a couple more questions for Ms. Johnson. Can you explain what the Training and Technical Assistance is, TTA?
Yes, the training and technical assistance refers to a wide variety of assistance and services that goes beyond traditional training. It helps partners assess their effectiveness. It helps broaden the reach of grants because it may be, the assistance could be provided to grantees and also non-recipients and share best practices. It allows them to consult with subject matter experts in designing their programs and to improve efficacy,
Okay.
and so forth.
How often do you make awards to TTA or other organizations to microfund grants?
We have several programs that do that, such as the body-worn camera program. Over the last 3 years, we've helped provide smaller awards to 400 small, rural, and tribal law enforcement agencies.
And, okay, can you explain what the Gun Crime Prevention Strategic Fund is?
Yes, the Gun Crime Strategic Prevention Fund is a $884 million mandatory request that would help increase hiring for critical law enforcement positions. Prosecutors also provide enhanced training and equipment for the criminal justice community.
Will this program replace an existing program?
No, sir, it would not.
Okay. Can you explain what the Training on Racial Profiling, De-escalation, and Duty to Intervene program is?
That is a new program requested under the Burn Justice Assistance Grants Appropriation that would enhance, develop law enforcement training to promote de-escalation strategies.
Will this program replace an existing program?
No, sir, it would not.
Okay. Can you explain what the Youth-Focused Hate Crime Prevention and Intervention Initiative is?
Yes, that is a new anti-hate crime program that focuses on youth, similar to the other programs that we have, but really focus on prevention strategies in the juvenile justice sphere.
So this has similar programs already in existence in other areas?
There are similar programs, but the eligible recipients are different.
Can you explain the difference?
I would say that it's focused on state, local, and community-based partners, which is different from our community-based violence prevention program or the Shepherd Bird program, but it's really focused on youth, helping them extract themselves from situations, and preventing hate crimes before they occur.
Can you explain what the Community-Based Alternatives to Youth Incarceration program is?
Yes, that is a program that is focused on helping states and localities repurpose emptying juvenile facilities. They are already having the trends in terms of those facilities are emptying out, but just closing those facilities, which are a hub for jobs and others, is not also a solution. So it's helping them reimagine those spaces and repurpose them.
And this program will not replace an existing program?
No, it will not.
Okay. Are you considering whether the various state and local entities that are requesting this funding have existing programs in place, or whether they are, and this funding would essentially duplicate other programs, or are you evaluating the state-by-state situations on the ground as you consider these applications?
As we can, I would say that these programs are developed based on needs that we are seeing emerging in the field, and that there aren't sufficient resources that are at that level to address these needs.
Okay. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your patience.
And with that, the hearing is adjourned.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just answer your question for JAG.
I'm sorry. We are reconvening.
Okay.
Yes.
For the FY '23, the JAG set aside was $38.5 million, so approximately $5 million more than the '22 enacted level.
Okay, thank you very much. Hearing is adjourned.